Welcome back to the 411 on Wrestling podcast. I'm your host, Blake Lovell. With me once again, co host Steve Cook. And we are back here to pay tribute to the one and only beautiful Bobby Eaton, Steve. A true, really, truly, I think if you go back and you're like, who is one of the most underrated, probably wrestlers in history? Like, I'm willing to go that far just based on how good this guy was in the ring. I think you put Bobby Eaton in that category.
And the thing about Bobby Eaton too, whenever people pass away, you'll often hear other folks say, "Well, nobody ever had bad things to say about that guy," and 99% of the time, that's complete BS. Because let's be honest, we all run afoul of somebody at some point or another. We've all made somebody upset, and there's always going to be somebody who has something bad to say about you or me or anybody else. Bobby Eaton is one of those instances where, yeah, nobody had bad things to say about Bobby Eaton.
Yeah.
Not from a personal perspective. If you listen to any story from one of his peers in the wrestling business, they just have nothing but good things to say about the guy behind the scenes, the kind of person he was to everybody, and certainly in behind the scenes great, and also in the ring great. And it's the thing about the underrated business, in a way, yes, because I don't think promoters really properly valued him for the most part. And it's weird because, especially in the 1990s, it was a weird time for Bobby in the 1990s after the Midnight Express and after the team of Arn Anderson, after the Blue Bloods. There's kind of a period in WCW where he just wasn't doing much of anything, and they just kind of kept him around. And you kind of wonder whether you could have done something or not. And it's tough to say. But I do think the fans appreciated him, and he had his weaknesses. Obviously, he was never a fireball personality, not a great promo, if you will. But man, you just put that guy in the ring, and he just got it done every single time.
He was fantastic, and yeah, of course, he passes away at 62. It's just that's young. I mean, that's young. His wife Donna had recently passed away. She was 57, and I know that's the story that Dave Meltzer
Yes.
brought up in the Wrestling Observer newsletter, which
The
I know,
daughter of the
yeah,
superstar Bill Dundee,
Bill
who
Dundee.
another wonderful character, Bill Dundee.
Yeah, Bill Dundee was something, and yeah, that's the story that's always brought up, was about how Dundee had basically, he had forbid her not to, do no talking to wrestlers, no dating wrestlers, none of that.
Yeah, and
And
Dundee was
that,
also the booker, so he was
right.
the boss of the business. So he didn't want her fraternising with his employees, because for one thing it'd be kind of weird, and for another thing he knew that most of the wrestlers are complete dirtbags and just horrible people.
Yeah, and so, he finally, I think they'd kept the relationship secret. I want to say it was like 9, 10 months, something like that. And she finally tells him that she's dating a wrestler, and Dundee loses it. And then she tells him it's Eaton, and he's like, "Oh, well, that's fine, right? Like, there's perfectly fine, because, like you said, he's one of those guys that." You do, like, you could Google, and in this day and age, we know, like, you can Google and probably find something on a lot of people, like you said, 90 something like that. Somebody's always going to say something bad, but I tried to find that, Steve. I couldn't find it. I can't find anything on anyone who looked at Bobby Eaton other than just one of these nicest guys. And like we just said, you think about what he accomplished, like, in his career. All of that's great, and we're going to talk about some of that. But it's like this guy went through this business, the professional wrestling business, and did not really form any enemies. And how you're able to do that in this business, that's not an easy thing to do.
No, it certainly isn't, especially when you start off in the place where you started off in Tennessee.
Right.
Working for Nick Goulas in that territory. It's a tough place not to make enemies. Just ask Jerry Lawler, ask any other people who went through there. And it's funny because back when I listened to the Wrestling Gold DVDs, the commentary by Cornette and Meltzer, and they brought up how back in that territory, Bobby Eaton kind of started off around the same time Randy Savage did, and they had a lot of tremendous matches there. And those were kind of matches where both the guys kind of learned the moves that they would use later on. Like Eaton picked up the Alabama Jam, and Savage got the top rope elbow and double axe handle, and they just kind of they kind of tried out the moves, and whoever could do a move better got it pretty much. And the shame was that match tapes those matches do not exist.
Yeah.
And one of the great travesties of justice is that there are not tapes of these matches between Randy Savage and Bobby Eaton from the 1970s, because I'm sure it would have been fantastic to watch on any DVD collection.
Again, that's quite a duo, right? And I think it's just, one of the things too is I don't think you think about it, and again, Meltzer did write this too. I think he always does a really good job, and I know people have different opinions on his reporting and all this other stuff, and that's fine. But like he always does a good job with the historical stuff like this, like going back and pointing out some of these things. But it is interesting to think about, Eaton, because, and this one of the things he pointed out was like, this guy, you think about, he started at such a young age, and like you said, he's wrestling the likes of Savage. He was what was it? I think he was teaming with Coco Beware like in the early '80s.
Yes, so with Coco Ware's part, the new wave. Yes,
sir. So like they're teaming together, and then they finally break off and have a loser leaves town match and all this other stuff. But like that's what I think you think about is, and Meltzer brought this up, was think about this guy starts at such a young age, and think about the style that he worked, being considered like one of the best in-ring workers there was at that time, and still since that point, like we still think of him that way in all the matches he had. But and again, remember, this is a time where these guys are wrestling twice a day, so like it's such an unbelievable schedule back then, to where like it says in the newsletter this week, it's like this guy was beat up really badly by the time he got into his 30s, like probably late 30s or so. And it's just like, my goodness, late 30s, right? We were just talking about that, like with ages and stuff when we did the NXT episode. It's like he was only in his late 30s, but you just think about what that grind had done to his body at that point, just given the style that he had worked. He was really ahead of his time in terms of his working style, it felt like, as he could pretty much work with anybody. But that still, it takes a toll on you. And back then, man, it was just, as we said, it's sort of a different scenario than maybe it is now. So.
Yeah, think about doing the Alabama Jam move, the top rope leg drop. Think about doing that move once a match.
Yeah.
When you're working 6-7 nights a week. And think about doing it in places with not exactly the most comfortable of wrestling rings.
No.
And think about doing that for, 15 years or so?
Yeah.
That adds up.
That's what everybody always talks about, like the Hogan leg drop, right?
That adds up, yeah. Even the Hulk Hogan leg drop added up. And Hogan was he was not going off the top rope, and even he had some bad problems later on. So that's why he came a lot earlier to Bobby Eaton.
And you hear all the wrestlers, right? They always talk about how hard the rings were back in the day. And, it's just like these things, which, that's not to say they're not now, because they are. That's one of those things where every time people are like, oh, well, it's like a trampoline. No, if you actually, like, it's not. But like back in the day, we're talking, there were probably a lot less opportunities to lighten the blow a bit on that. So yeah, like to have that kind of move and to do that, like it was very easy to probably, beat up your body. And again, this is something else that has been brought up. It's like Bobby Eaton's not this guy, which we know, like steroids ran wild in that era. Like there were guys who were doing all kinds of stuff, but this was a guy who seemingly just, did whatever. Now I know, later down the road, maybe there were issues and stuff, but it's like, I mean, this guy seemingly just came through again in a business that just could pull you in all these different directions. And it just seemed like he just continued to be like one of those consistent rocks that anyone could lean on, no matter what promotion he's in, no matter whether he's wrestling a match in, WCW or whatever, like it just didn't matter. He was always someone that you felt like you could count on, not just, I'm sure, as a promoter, but also as a fan. Like if you're watching the matches, if you're watching the Midnight Express or you're watching Bobby Eaton, you pretty much know what you're going to get. And I think that always shined through, even now when you go back and watch some of the stuff from that era. And I had to pull out some of my notes from some of the reviews I did, like looking back at shows from like 88, 89. If which again, I'm sure most people listening to this have, but like if you have never actually gone back and like studied the Midnight Express and like what they meant, I mean, it is an unbelievable thing to go back and just see the impact they had, not just on tag team wrestling, but like on wrestling in general during that era.
It's really an amazing body of work, and I, I started watching wrestling in '92. It was a little bit after the Midnight Express, but of course, eventually I did go back and I did watch a lot of their stuff, and it's amazing. There's no other word to describe it really, and it's interesting how they came together too, because we all know the story about how Midnight Express was formed is because Bill Watts and Jerry Jarrett had an exchange of talent. And, because both their rosters needed a little bit of freshening up, and some of the guys had been in the same place for a while. So, time to do some changes. And one of the teams that needed a change was the Rock and Roll Express. Ricky and Robert, they needed the change. They needed to go somewhere else because they're stuck in the shadow of the Fabulous Ones.
Yeah.
So, Bill Watts takes the Rock and Roll Express, and the Rock and Roll Express need opponents. So somehow Bill Watts figures out that the perfect opponents for the Rock and Roll Express would be, a veteran heel, Dennis Condrey, a classic Southern heel. This young kid, Bobby Eaton, he'd already been like the heavyweight champion over there. So it's not like he's a greenhorn, but he's still very young. And you know what? It'd probably be nice if they had a manager. So there's the second string manager, Jim Cornette. He is just ranting and raving like a lunatic. And man, I want to punch him. So the fans will probably want to punch him too. So he puts those three together, and somehow it just completely works. And the Midnight Express becomes one of the top tag teams of all time. It's crazy.
Well, they and of course it's fitting, right? I mean, I think Eaton's last match was against it was against Ricky Morton
Yes.
in October 2015, I think it was. So
They never stopped feuding, man. That was that was some
Never,
bad blood
yeah.
between those two teams. It's amazing, but and it even lasted through the Dennis Condrey years when they magically found Stan Lane to fill the void, and he filled the void quite perfectly. And it's tough for us to even sit there and do justice to just how good both those teams were. And Bobby Eaton was the rock of the crew. He just made everything work.
he did, and those are the matches to me. And I go back and look at my notes, and I'm thinking back to watching some of these shows because I think it was probably it was a year or two ago. I think I went back and watched the entire 87, 88, 89, that era. I watched all sort of the big shows probably.
So, okay, and so just out of curiosity, I'm kind of wondering, what's your highest rated Midnight Express match?
All right, so here's what I have again, based on what I pulled up, just the ones that I reviewed. So obviously I didn't review everything. There are some Mid-Atlantic shows I didn't, which I know, you look back and some of the matches they have with the Fantastics and stuff, there's just, take your pick, right? I think, take your pick. It doesn't matter.
Champions, one with the Fantastics. Oh gosh.
So
Yes.
the one I have though rated as the highest, you and I, it's odd that we talked about this, but you and I, when we recorded one of our most recent podcasts, I want to say it was probably a week ago or something. You and I, for some reason, I brought this up to you. I said, I think we were talking about, you were doing a top, someone had pitched an idea to you to do a top Ric Flair opponents or something like that. And I had brought up, I said, and I don't even think we put this on the podcast. We may have talked about this after the podcast, but it's I said, well, there's actually a really sneaky good tag team match with Ric Flair, which I know a lot of people remember, but that's the one tag team Ric Flair match I remember, and that's from Clash of the Champions 4. It was Midnight Express versus Ric Flair and Barry Windham. That's the one I have rated the highest. I loved it. Now I'm sure, again, you think about all the parties involved, that and Clash of the Champions 4, and that was what, 80, was that 88 or 89? I love that. Now, that one wasn't much higher than, I have several on here I'm looking, I have several with the Fantastics. First Clash of Champions, you had Midnight Express versus Fantastics. There were some others, the one they had against the Rock and Roll Express, Wrestle War 90, that was another one that I have rated pretty highly. They had that match too, was at Starrcade 88, the Midnights versus the original Midnight Express. That was an interesting match. It wasn't as high as some of the others, but I just loved the Midnight Express versus Flair and Windham from Clash of the Champions 4. That's one we're going to probably mention a lot of different matches, but that's one I would definitely go back and watch. The crowd was just insane. But like we said too, anything with the Rock and Roll Express, anything with the Fantastics, for the most part, those always delivered, no matter which company they were wrestling in with that stuff.
I remember, Larry and I talked about the Clash of Champions 4 one time with the Flair Windham versus Midnight Express. And Flair and Windham both at pretty much at the peak of their physical powers, pretty much there. Just four amazing workers in there. Is all I can say about that. But the Midnight Express, they just it's kind of weird because they went through Mid South. They did all the stuff with Bill Watson, Junkyard Dog. Obviously hooked up the Rock and Roll Express, and then they go to Road Clash where they have a lot of matches with Fantastics. Come into the NWA and work the Rock and Roll Express, and they just kind of carry things for a while. But then we kind of get to a point where once the Jim Crockett Promotions kind of switches to WCW, then you start having kind of the BS go on. You have, that Jim Herd, that guy. not to bury anybody here, but Jim Herd, I don't know, he didn't really value the Midnight Express as much as some people did, and they were pushed down the card, not given too many opportunities to succeed, and it ends up that eventually Jim Cornette, I don't know if you noticed or not, Jim Cornette's a little bit of a hothead, a little bit of temper, right?
A little bit.
A little bit. So eventually he just kind of gets tired of it, and one day, I think was it Ole Anderson who made the suggestion that if you didn't like it, you could just leave, and Cornette responded, "Well, that's the best idea I've heard in a long time." So he leaves, and Stan Lane decides he's going to leave with him because Stan Lane has some stuff going on in his personal life that, Jim Cornette and Stan Lane leave, and they all of a sudden realize that, well, we can't let Bobby leave because Bobby's got family support. So Bobby just stays.
Like that trio, right? Like it's just what a story. Like just in and of itself. Like just I mean, but like we said too, right? Like it's like Bobby's the rock of that entire thing. He's what holds everything together.
And they weren't gonna be mad at Bobby Eaton because Jim Cornette and Stan Lane left.
Yeah,
because everybody knew Bobby Eaton was a good guy.
I think I'm looking now. We talk about like top matches and stuff for him, and the one that I think is like rated. Let's see. I'm gonna look on Cage Match here because I think this is where there's a lot of good stuff. But like, according to this, now this is again these are logged in Cage Match, but the two that got the highest, these both got 5 stars according to Meltzer, and these got basically rated 9 or higher by voters on Cage Match for what that's worth. The one at the very top in terms of Cage Match rating was the Bobby Eaton Stan Lane versus Bobby Fulton Tommy Rogers from the April 26, 1988 episode. Yeah, so that's going to be Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, April 26, 1988. And then the other one involving Bobby Eaton, War Games, 92. Yes, that's Arn Anderson, Beautiful Bobby, Larry Sabisco, Rick Rude, Steve Austin versus Barry Windham, Dustin Rhodes, Nikita Koloff, Ricky Steamboat, and Sting. I still think back to that. I'm like, my goodness, what an assortment of talent in there, right? Wow.
Yep.
What a group.
Of course, we got to that because after Jim Cornette and Stan Lane left, Bobby Eaton actually became a babyface. Which is, you would think Bobby Eaton would be a great babyface because he was such a great guy. And he was a pretty great babyface in the ring. But for whatever reason, I don't know. He was just always better as a heel, wasn't he? I guess part of it was because heels kind of call the matches.
Yeah.
So Eaton was good calling. He was good doing that, so it kind of worked out better for him. But eventually, Paulie Dangerously forms a super group, and the talent in that group, my goodness, just up and down. The talent level of everybody in that group is just completely insane. It's a great 9 months or so of television in 1992. And of course, I guess the biggest blow from what was the War Games match. But as a part of this whole run, you got the tag team of Beautiful Bobby with Arn Anderson, which is interesting because you had Bobby Eaton was the Rock of the Midnight Express, and of course Arn Anderson is probably the most consistent member of the Four Horsemen. And it just so happened that Arn and Bobby were also best friends outside the ring. So they just had great chemistry together. And I was wondering when I was putting together my list of the best Bobby Eaton tag team partners. I mean, if Arn had a couple more years with Bobby, that team might have just passed up the Midnight Express. You don't know?
I mean, you talk about two cerebral workers like Arn Anderson, Bobby Eaton. They know their way around a wrestling ring. I think we can say that safely. Here's another match, and I'm sure I had forgotten about this one, but I'm, of course, perusing Cage Match now, and I'm like, why did I not think of this one? Because I must not have just put this in my notes, but I know I would have had it pretty high, too. Midnight Express versus the Southern Boys, Great American Bash, 1990.
Ah, yes, I was thinking of that one. And
That's
Tracy Smothers.
that was for the NWA U.S. Tag Team titles. Yep. On the show itself, I don't think was necessarily great, but that was that was good. So
I want to say that is one of I want to say it was an opening match, and I want to say it's one of those opening matches where they could all go back behind curtains and say, "Follow that,"
probably
and nobody could.
they that was it, right? Like they were never, I mean, not never, but rarely were they, they were not always in that just top spot where they're main eventing everything on these big, whatever NWA, WCW shows or anything like that, right? Like they were just so good though that it didn't matter. Like it didn't matter where I actually think the one I mentioned was the one against Flair and Wyndham that did main event Clash of Champions 4. But
Yeah, especially towards the end of Lane Eaton, where they were not
yeah,
being utilized properly. They'd usually be thrown out there in like that opening match spot
yeah.
with like the Southern Boys or the Rock and Roll Express or whoever, and they would just blow the doors out off the arena. And that is the best way they could stick it to the promotion, pretty much.
Yeah, they're not the only ones that have done that, right? Like we've seen others take that same approach, where it's like, hey, if you're going to put us in this spot, we're going to take advantage of it, and we're going to basically, show you
we're going to ruin the rest of your show.
Yeah. So that was, it's just incredible. Like I said, to think about Bobby Eaton and to know that this is a guy that navigated these waters of professional wrestling, just the way that he did, and to not just, really just to be part of one of the greatest tag teams ever, and to really, never kind of be that guy that we've seen this before, Steve. Like there are people that if they reach that level, there's a lot that can get to you with that. Like you can really start to buy into sort of your own narrative and just, your own hype and all this other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, this guy just seemed like he was just the most, I don't know, like just the most grounded, nice, laid back type of guy that just made his way through the business, probably made a lot of money. And, at the end of the day, we're sitting here talking about just, again, one of the best and probably one of the most underrated, like I said, to actually do this. If you just think about everything that came along with it, the in-ring work, crafting a team the way that they did, the Midnight Express, it's just a name. We'll always know that team name. Like anytime it says Midnight Express, oh yeah, like I remember this, I remember that. Just a one-of-a-kind type deal. And I always think back, I'm like, who are some of the teams maybe that they didn't get to work with? Like maybe they were just a couple years off, or I don't even know. But I always think back to that. I'm like, were there some teams that like they just missed on maybe having a chance to have just a great program with them or that? Like I know they had some matches with the Road Warriors. I think there was, I'm trying to remember if there was any in particular.
Yeah, they had the Road Warriors, and of course that led to Starrcade '86.
Yeah.
The team that jumps to mind right off the top of my head, and I'm trying to remember if they ever did have they might have had a match or two, but a team that came along and kind of peaked right after they left, Rick and Scott Steiner.
Yes, that's a good point. Yeah, the Steiners.
That would have been a team. And the Steiners, then, of course, later on, the Steiners would have a series of matches with another Cornette team, the Heavenly Bodies.
Yes, that's true.
Which was pretty great.
I want to say like it was 90, right? It felt like 1990 was sort of that point where, the Steiners started really getting, that was when WCW was, I think probably put an understatement to say that they were undergoing some changes, probably just trying to try some different things and all of that. But yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't even thought about sort of.
I'm trying to think that they might have had some matches. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that they never had a match because they were there at the same time. But I want to say that the Steiners were probably. I think the Steiners were pushed more in the World Tag Team level with like Doom and people like that, while Midnight Express was kind of down the card in the U.S. Tag Team title scene with like the Fantastics and Dynamic Dudes and folks like that.
I'm looking down the list here, so. I mean, there's a lot on here. Like, again, this is why I enjoy, like, cage matches.
Well, if you're going to do the fantasy booking, you could put them against, like, the British Bulldogs.
That's true.
Put them
British
against,
Bulldogs,
like, the Hart Foundation, all these. How about the Rockers? I know the Rockers Midnight Express never met.
Yeah, that would be another one. I'm trying to think back of some of these if I just don't remember there. So, like, apparently, let's see, April of '88, you had the Midnight Express versus Lex Luger and Sting. So that must have been interesting. I'm trying to see if there's any other that just really stand out. that I'm thinking back to try to go back and watch. Like you said, we talked about the Road Warriors one. They had that one in another one in '87. And then, I mean, really, like we said, most of these in terms of if you just want like to go back and watch some Bobby Eaton matches and the ones that are probably universally loved, like there are just so many that they have with either the Rock and Roll Express or the Fantastics. Like you just really can't go wrong. Like there are just a lot that are really, really good. And yeah, like that's just, I mean, unless you want to go back and watch them against the Dynamic Dudes, that's another one you could do.
But there's also kind of a perverse enjoyment out of that too, with especially I think the match was, I want to say the match was in Philadelphia, and there was the big turn. You know, they had the whole gimmick where Cornette had agreed to manage the Dynamic Dudes because, you know, for some reason Cornette and Midnight were bay faces at this point. It was a thing that happened, you know.
Yeah.
These things happen from time to time, so they're bay faces. And Dynamic Dudes, you know, Johnny Ace, Shane Douglas, they decide, oh, we want Jim Cornette to manage us.
Yeah.
Which, you know, I can see why they would say that. Except for why would you trust Jim Cornette? I don't know. But, you know, it ends up being this whole trash talky thing, and Midnight Express gets jealous or whatever, and they wind up having this match. And Cornette is going to be in the neutral corner. He's going to be, you know, non-biased. He's going to be he's going to be completely fair and balanced. And wouldn't you know who won the pony? And Jim Cornette turns his back on Dynamic Dudes. And, you know, it's supposed to be Jim Cornette turning heel again, and Midnight's turning heel again. And they got one of the loudest pops of the night. Because nobody liked the Dynamic Dudes.
No.
Especially in Philadelphia.
Yeah, Dynamic Dudes. What a there's another. You want to go back and watch some of this? All right, before we wrap up, Steve, I'm going to give you some trivia here. All right, so on Cage Match, the highest rated Bobby Eaton singles matches, which now that I think about it, I remember one of these in particular. There are three that are all kind of in the same range. Can you name any of them?
There was one with Ric Flair.
That's the highest rated one.
And I want to say it was on, I think it's on like Main Event or something like that.
Clash of the Champions 15.
Okay.
June 14th, 91.
And Flair specifically requested that match because he wanted to wrestle Bobby Eaton.
2 out of 3 falls. Yep.
So you got one there. And I want to say also, when there was a title, I know there was a TV title change between Bob Eaton and Arn Anderson that might be on there.
Super Brawl, 1991. There's a match between Arn and Beautiful Bobby. So that's May 19th, 91. That's a WCW Super Brawl. So maybe that was it. I don't know if that was the title match or not. I'm not sure. But that's the other one. And then the third one, I think I could give you until I don't even know when, but I don't think you're guessing the third one. But here's your hint. It was under the Beautiful Bobby moniker, so it's in that same time frame. It is in 91 as well. So
okay. Did he wrestle Steve Austin?
He may have, but that's not the one that's in this range. Although, you know, actually, he's got a couple more. Well, there's another one against Scott Steiner in 1990 that was rated highly by Meltzer. Got 3 3/4. But the one in this one, 1991, October 27th, at WCW Halloween Havoc 1991, Beautiful Bobby versus Terrence Taylor.
Okay, yeah, I was sat there all day, and even though Terry Taylor was a good worker back in his day.
Yeah.
By the time he's Terrence Taylor, I think we all kind of checked out.
That's not one I could really remember. So I was just kind of fascinated by that. But we've given you, listen, if you want to go back and watch some Bobby Eaton matches, hopefully this gives you a nice assortment to choose from, because there are a lot. And like we said, you know what, Steve, there are probably a lot out there that we can't even watch. There's probably some that, you know.
Oh, yeah, there's a ton that we can't watch.
Yeah, so, you know, fire up Peacock, as frustrating as it can be, and go back, watch some Bobby Eaton matches, and there's plenty of them to choose from, like we said. So,
and give a shout out to the his team with Lord Steven Regal as well, the Blue Bloods.
Yes, the Blue Bloods.
Especially the introductory vignettes where Lord Steven taught the Earl of Eaton how to be British, and it's just, you know, the whole My Fair Lady bit, just fantastic.
Just incredible. So yeah, check those out. Here's a couple other random ones. Bobby Eaton versus Steve Austin, June the 3rd, 1991, and then Bobby Eaton versus Chris Jericho, October 21st, 1996. So there's another one. that's interesting with that. So how about Bobby Eaton versus Michael Hayes in 1992? That's interesting as well.
I don't know if it's highly rated or not, but we mentioned earlier that Eaton and Randy Savage worked together
Yes.
back in the the late 70s, and they wound up having a random match on, I think it was Worldwide, around the time when Savage was part of the NWO. And usually on Worldwide by that point, you had like squash matches and not very competitive things. And, Randy Savage's respect for Bobby Eaton was such that he was going to have a 50-50 match, even though Eaton was not getting pushed at all at this time. He was doing nothing, let's be honest. But Savage was not going, he's going to have a 50-50 match, and he's going to cheat to win. Because that is the respect he had for Bobby Eaton.
Everyone did. I think that's the common theme we can kind of, look at. That was it. Like, find people who didn't have respect for Bobby Eaton, and I guess I may find you a liar, because I just don't know how you couldn't for this guy. As we said, one of the best to do it, probably one of the most underrated to do it, and as everyone has said, probably one of the nicest to do it as well. So you just see a lot of the reaction from the current stars. Like, again, these are people who probably, a lot of them, some of them may not have grown up watching Bobby Eaton, but I think there's still such a respect for what he did. One of a kind, and he will definitely be missed. So there are some thoughts on beautiful Bobby Eaton, and as we said, we will, continue look, there's plenty of things you can go back and watch. I'm sure I'll go back and watch now that we talked about it. I'm like, all right, I'm going to go back and watch some of these matches that I haven't watched in a couple years. Of course, for all of our other wrestling coverage, you can find it all 411mania.com. Check out all of our news, reviews, columns, and everything up there. And as we continue to say, be sure to subscribe to the podcast. Any podcast app you use, search for 411 on Wrestling. We'll also, as always, have the GoFundMe link for Larry Zonka's family in the show notes. So continue to share and share and contribute to that if you can. And everything else, 411mania.com. But thanks as always for listening to the podcast, and we'll talk to you next time here on the 411 on Wrestling Podcast.